biting wind whipped at the ferry as it sliced through the dark, churning waters, carrying David back to a place he'd sworn he'd left behind forever. It had been years, a lifetime really, since he had last set foot in his hometown, the small, coastal community that held more shadows than sunlight in his memories. He gripped the railing, the cold metal a stark contrast to the feverish dread that coiled in his stomach. This wasn't a homecoming, it was an exhumation. He was returning to the house, the silent tomb that held the echoes of his daughter, Masha. The ferry shuddered as it docked, and David stepped onto the familiar pier. The air was heavy with the scent of salt and decaying seaweed, a smell that used to bring him comfort, but now just tasted of loss. He walked through the quiet streets, each footstep a heavy echo of his past, until he reached the house. The old Victorian stood hunched against the encroaching night, its windows like empty eyes staring out at him. The paint was peeling, the garden overgrown. It was a reflection of his soul neglected, decaying. He fumbled with the keys, his hand trembling slightly, and pushed open the door. The hinges groaned in protest, the sound swallowed by the silence within. The air was thick with dust and the lingering smell of decay, a smell that spoke of absence and the slow march of time. He called out, his voice cracking, "Masha." But the only response was the mournful creak of the old house settling. A wave of nausea washed over him as he remembered the dream, the nightmare that had become his nightly torment. He saw again the dimly lit bathroom, the white porcelain of the tub stained crimson, and Masha's lifeless form submerged beneath the water. Her pale wrists bore the cruel marks, the final testament of her despair. The bruises on her face, a brutal reminder of the struggle, haunted him even in the waking world. It was never just a dream. It was a memory, a replay of the horrific truth of what he found 4 months ago. The memory was so vivid, so real, that he often wondered if he had ever really woken up from that horror. He began his search. Each step through the house was like turning the pages of a horrific book. He went to Masha's room first. The room was frozen in time, her posters still on the wall, her clothes still hanging in the closet, like she might walk in any minute. The silence was oppressive, pressing down on him with the weight of her absence. It felt as though she were just behind him, always out of sight. He touched her things, the faded plush toys she loved, the worn books she used to read, each item a sharp jab in his heart. He was a man adrift in a sea of grief. He had lost his compass, his anchor, and the storm within him raged on. His life had become a twisted cycle of despair. He attended a grief support group, a sterile space filled with other broken souls. He'd share his story, speaking of the hollowness, the guilt that gnawed at him. He would recount the endless nights where sleep was a rare and unwelcome guest, his dreams a relentless replay of Masha's death. He'd mention his wife Michelle, who had left him, her words like daggers. She blamed him. She said he was too obsessed with work to notice Masha's pain, too focused on his career to see that his little girl was drowning. He remembered the day he received the news of Masha's death. He had been in a business meeting, discussing deadlines and profits, completely oblivious to the cataclysm unfolding in his home. The guilt was a constant companion, a malevolent presence that whispered in his ear, reminding him of his failures as a father. He had been too busy living his life to see that his daughter was struggling to survive. The support group meetings became his grim routine, a place where he could try to make sense of the senseless. But it was of no help. The other mourners were adrift just like him, their words empty, hollow comfort for hollow hearts. It was during these meetings that he started to notice them, the 4 women. They always sat together, a silent, unsettling quartet. Their eyes were sharp, too knowing, their expressions a disturbing mix of curiosity and amusement. They would exchange glances, stifled laughter bubbling beneath the surface whenever he spoke of Masha. Their behavior was like a constant itch, a nagging feeling that something was terribly wrong. It unnerved him, a strange disquiet that settled in the pit of his stomach every time he saw them. He couldn't explain it, but their presence felt malevolent, as if they were feeding on his grief. He started to avoid them, his eyes scanning the room, ensuring their gaze didn't land on him, their laughter didn't reach him. He started to become more and more isolated. He had become consumed with the notion that Masha's spirit still lingered within the walls of the house. He bought an old Ouija board, an antique piece that had always been kept at the back of an antique store. It sat on his bedside table, a silent promise, a desperate hope for a connection beyond the veil of death. But fear always held him back, the fear of what he might unleash, of what he might discover. He was afraid of speaking to Masha, but was even more afraid of who might answer him instead. He spent his days wandering through the house, retracing Masha's steps, trying to capture her essence, trying to hold on to whatever remained of her. He would sit in her room for hours, staring at her things, imagining her presence. At night, the house would creak and groan, each sound a whisper in the darkness, each shadow a possible manifestation of her spirit. He started to imagine that he could hear her voice, faint and distant, echoing through the empty rooms. The line between the living and the dead was becoming increasingly blurred, he thought. He was walking into a strange place, a liminal space that existed between grief and madness. One evening, as he walked home from the support group, his mind still heavy with the day's sorrow, they approached him. The four women, their faces illuminated by the dim streetlights, stood blocking his path. Their smiles seemed too wide, too predatory, and their eyes glinted with an unsettling intensity. "We know about Masha," the tallest of them said, her voice a low, hypnotic drone. "We know about your pain." He stopped, his heart pounding in his chest. How could they know? The knowledge felt like a violation, a cruel intrusion into his private grief. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "We are followers of the ancient ways," another woman said. Her voice was smooth like silk, but it sent chills down his spine. "We can communicate with the spirits of the departed." They knew about Masha, and they knew her name. They knew details that he had never shared with anyone, details that only he could know. The knowledge struck him like a physical blow. He wanted to scream, to run away, to hide from their knowing gaze. But he was trapped, caught in a web of their making. They invited him to their residence, a hidden place far away from the eyes of the world, to help him speak with Masha's spirit. The invitation was like a dark temptation, a dangerous lure. His heart screamed, no, his mind was screaming, run, but his grief was screaming the loudest, yes. He declined, of course. His mind was screaming at him to stay away from these women. They were trouble, he knew it. They were dangerous, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they knew something he didn't. They knew about Masha. They knew things they shouldn't. Their words lingered in his mind, their insidious promises taking root like poisonous weeds. That night, he heard them. The noises coming from Masha's room were soft at first, just a whisper, the sound of rustling paper and soft footfalls. But as the night deepened, they grew louder, more insistent, more demanding. His fear battled with his curiosity. The desire to know if Masha was truly there was almost unbearable. He was drawn to her room, like a moth to a flame, a moth that knew it was about to be consumed. He slowly opened the door, the hinges creaking, and stepped inside. He searched the room, his eyes scanning the shadows and shapes, until he found it. A diary, tucked away behind a pile of old school books, lay innocently on her desk. The leather was worn, the pages dog-eared, filled with Masha's messy handwriting. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the diary, unsure if he should invade her privacy. But the need to know, to understand the horror that had claimed her life, overrode his hesitation. He flipped through the pages, each entry like a descent into the abyss. Masha's words spoke of a growing unease, of being watched, of being stalked by shadowy figures that seemed to move through the walls and dance in the corners of the room. She had described the nightmares she was having, terrifying visions that mirrored David's. The diary spoke of fear, of isolation, of a desperate longing for escape. One page contained a drawing, a crude sketch of a crying girl surrounded by sinister symbols, dark and malevolent. The drawing was a window into the darkness that had consumed her, a glimpse into the terror that had stalked her in the shadows. There was also a photo, a snapshot of Masha with 4 other girls, their faces scratched out, brutally removed from the picture. The photograph sent chills down his spine, its disturbing implications sending his mind spinning. He read into the early hours of the morning, his eyes burning, his heart aching. The diary was a testament to her suffering, a horrifying account of her final descent into madness and fear. He felt that she was trying to warn him, trying to reach out from beyond the grave. The more he read, the more the house felt alive, pulsating with an ancient, malevolent energy. He felt eyes on him, the unseen presence lurking just beyond the edges of his vision. He went back to the grief group, the diary clutched in his hand. He confronted the women, their knowing smiles now appearing more like grotesque grins. "What did you do to her?" he demanded, his voice shaking with rage and fear. They smiled, a slow, deliberate unfolding of their lips that sent shivers down his spine. They told him that Masha had been involved with their cult, a group that worshipped an ancient demon called Kano. They claimed that they were chosen to be vessels for this demon. Each year, they had to offer up a member of their group. Masha had been chosen. They described the cult, their practices, their beliefs. They spoke of an ancient darkness, of rituals performed under the light of the full moon, of the chanting and the sacrifices. They reveled in their power, in their connection to the demon. Masha, they said, had tried to escape, but the cult's influence had been too strong, too all-consuming. They had driven her to madness, to the despair that had ultimately led to her death. Masha's death was not an accident, they said. It had been a carefully planned sacrifice, a dark offering to their demonic master. The revelation was like a physical blow, each word a hammer blow to his heart. He had been living in ignorance, blind to the forces that had taken his daughter. The women claimed that Masha's spirit was trapped in their dimension, tethered to their dark rituals. They said that the only way to free her was to perform another ritual, a final act that would sever the connection between her spirit and the demon, and would free her to move on. They offered him hope, a glimmer in the suffocating darkness, but he knew that it was a false hope. He had no choice, not really. He would do anything for Masha, even if it meant walking straight into the mouth of hell. He agreed to their terms and followed them to their isolated lair. The place was a nightmare made real. Nestled deep within a forgotten part of the woods, it was a crumbling, desolate structure that pulsed with an unnatural energy. The walls were covered in strange symbols, painted in dried blood and animal fat. Candles flickered on the floor, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to writhe with a life of their own. An altar stood at the center of the room, a crude platform made of bone and stone, stained with the residue of countless dark rituals. It reeked of decay and death, a place where the veil between worlds was thin, where dark things could crawl out of the shadows. The stench of incense and decay filled the air, making his stomach churn and his eyes water. It felt as though the very stones were whispering of death and despair. As the ritual began, the women began to chant, their voices rising in a discordant chorus that sent shivers down his spine. They moved with unnatural grace, their bodies swaying and twisting as if they were puppets controlled by some unseen force. The air grew thick and heavy, the room becoming darker, the shadows deepening. He felt as though he was being pulled into a vortex of darkness, drawn into the heart of their evil. The room started to distort and sway, the walls seemed to breathe and pulsate. Visions flashed before his eyes, glimpses of Masha, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes filled with terror. She warned him, her voice weak and strained, that the women were lying. They didn't want to free her. They wanted him. He was to be the next vessel, the next sacrifice to their demon god. His blood ran cold, a sickening wave of nausea washing over him. He had been a fool, a pawn in their sick game. He had been so desperate, so consumed by grief, that he had walked blindly into their trap. He tried to escape, to run from the horror, but he was weak, weakened by grief and a lack of sleep. The women were too strong, too quick. They overpowered him, their hands like icy claws, their eyes filled with dark delight. They dragged him to the altar, pinning him down, preparing him for the sacrifice. He was trapped, surrounded, with no hope for escape. The only thing he could think about was Masha, and how she must have felt in her final moments. In his panic, his hand brushed against the Ouija board he had brought with him, a small comfort in the depths of this horror. He desperately reached for it, and tried to channel Masha's spirit. The board began to tremble, the letters glowing with an eerie light. The air crackled with energy, a palpable force that filled the room. The chanting stopped, the women falling silent as Masha's ghost materialized before them. She was not the sad, broken girl he had mourned, but a being of pure rage, her eyes burning with ethereal fury. She screamed, a primal cry of pain and anger, and lunged at the cult members. The women shrieked in terror, their faces contorted with fear as Masha's ghost attacked them. The room descended into chaos, the chanting replaced by screams, the candles snuffed out, plunging the room into darkness. David, fueled by a surge of adrenaline, managed to break free. He stumbled towards the altar, ripping at the symbols and tearing at the fabric of their dark magic. He destroyed the altar, shattering the connection between the cult and their demonic master. The lair began to collapse, the very stones groaning and shifting, the roof threatening to fall in on top of them. He stumbled out of the collapsing lair, his lungs burning, his muscles screaming. He looked back and saw that the entire structure had come down in a heap of rubble and dust, leaving nothing but a gaping maw in the earth. The nightmare was finally over. He was free, but the scars of what he had experienced would remain. Masha's spirit appeared one final time, her form ethereal and translucent, her expression no longer one of rage, but one of peace. She thanked him, her voice like a gentle breeze, for freeing her from the darkness, for saving her from their evil clutches. She smiled at him, a soft, loving smile before fading away, like mist in the morning light. He never went back to the house that had been her prison and his personal hell. He moved to a new city, trying to rebuild his life. But the memories, the nightmares, the horror of what had happened never faded. He would see Masha in the faces of strangers, in the shadows at the corners of his eyes. He would hear her voice in the rustling of the leaves, in the whispering of the wind. He kept a few of his things, a few reminders of his old life. He found an old photo album and flipped through it. But in one of the pictures he found a scratched-out photo of the 4 women, just like the picture in Masha's diary. It was a silent promise that the cult, the darkness, the nightmare, might not be entirely gone. It was a reminder that sometimes the things that lurk in the shadows, the things that crawl out from the darkness, never truly disappear.